2 suitcases, life in the backpack, new destination, full tank and a roadmap. My DJ, my best friend by my side, windows rolled down as I put the car in drive.
I don't know where we'll go, just know that we've got miles. We've got miles and miles to go.
Hi, I'm Dee Perry, and this is another episode of CIFF Speaks, the official podcast of the Cleveland International Film Festival. And I'm joined by my co-host, Aaron Spears. Hey, Aaron.
Good morning, Dee.
And we are both pleased to introduce our guest today, and he is the director of the film Searching for Mr. Rugoff. That is Ira Deutchman. Ira, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So we want to start with you introducing the film to our CIFF audience, as if you were giving an opening statement for a theater or a living room. What would you want to say about Searching for Mr. Rugoff?
Well, first of all, I've had a little bit of practice doing this. So I'll try to reach deep into my soul and find it again. I mean, most people who know me that I have spent most of my career as a marketer and a distributor of films rather than a director, although I've produced a lot of movies as well. And this is actually my first time directing a movie. And the reason I went ahead and made this film was kind of by accident. For many, many years, I've been telling stories about this guy by the name of Don Rugoff, who was my first boss in the film industry and who arguably is the person I learned everything I know and owe my entire career to. But it took me a very, very long time to realize that. And part of the process of making this movie was about the fact that I was telling these outrageous stories about this guy who was truly crazy. I mean, literally a lunatic, but also kind of a genius in terms of the way that he marketed movies and got people interested in things that were not necessarily all that obvious. And he was easily one of the most important people in the art film business in the 60s and 70s. And what kind of flabbergasted me was when I found out that I was telling these stories to people and they didn't have any idea who this guy was. And I realized that he had kind of been wiped off the face of the map. He sort of disappeared. And it became this little mystery that, frankly, I wanted to get to the bottom of. I wanted to try to figure out what really happened to this guy and to sort of deal with my mixed feelings about him in some fashion. So that set me on this journey of making this movie. At the very beginning, I actually thought it was going to be more like an oral history, but I was using a video camera to record these interviews. And I wasn't 100% sure whether it would ever add up to a film. But as I began to put it together, I realized that it might be interesting, not just for people who are interested in the movie business, and especially given the fact that we're in this moment where people, even before the coronavirus became a factor, people were questioning whether theatrical movies had a future. And I realized that at the time that this guy Rugoff was operating, there were reasons to believe that the movie business was failing at that time. So I felt like it might have been kind of timely. So for some people, this movie is going to be a bit of a nostalgia trip. And for some people, it may be kind of a history lesson. But for me, it was sort of an exorcism.
But I've got to say, you mentioned mixed feelings. And for me, the form and the content of the film seemed to mirror those feelings. I mean, there was a seesaw of disapproval and praise. And I wanted to find out how you settled on that approach to the subject.
It was complicated. I truly started out the process not knowing how I was going to feel about this guy at the end of the process. And it was really the interviews that I did with people that pointed me in what I think turned out to be a much more positive direction than I actually started out feeling. And I mean, honestly, I do feel more positive about this guy and his history now than I did when I started making this movie, which was nearly 5 years ago. And, the seesaw had to do with the fact that I realized as I was beginning to cut the film together, that if I were going to tell the film chronologically, that it would be really dull because, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It requires that you get into the weeds in a way that I really didn't want the film to be. And I realized that the movie was meant to be, at least in my mind, more of an emotional journey than it was
Mhm.
a historical journey. And so the structure of the movie reflects my feelings. And so, that seesaw was not intended initially, but ultimately became part of what I ended up embracing.
And it's very engaging. I mean, it drew me in. The more bad things I heard, the more I wanted to know about this guy and how he had so much influence in this industry. A section of the film, and you talk too about the theaters. A section of the film deals with social event aspect of the films around the Rugoff theaters in New York City. Talk about the showcase that he built for film.
Yeah, he was. I mean, you have to put it in the perspective of what was going on at that time. The movie business was indeed in trouble. The major studios were doing terrible, terrible movies. And the what's interesting is that the enemy, if you want to call it that, was the same thing that people talk about now, which is it was the advent of television. Television was just in the early '60s. Television was really just beginning to be a mass medium, and there was a lot of worry about whether people would ever come back to the movies. And all of the interesting work, the true interesting work that was being done in the film world, was being done mostly by independent filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, and more importantly, international filmmakers. And what Rugoff did was he took these kinds of movies, which had been relegated pretty much to basements of, ratty kind of film societies and stuff like that, and he built these amazing modern they weren't palaces in the old sense of the word, but just these gorgeous theaters that were purpose built to show films, and it started to equate. Or I guess the better way to put it is that he took the whole concept of film as art and made it more tangible by making the theaters such an incredible environment to see these movies in. And by doing this, he gave a legitimacy to the art film that really hadn't existed before.
This is the time period too, and like the idea of an art house theater is kind of hitting mass consciousness. Like you said, it moves out of college film societies or underground screening rooms and becomes like the hip thing to do now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think part of that had to do with the fact that people who graduated from those college film societies, and I'm one of those people also, obviously when they went out into the real world, they already had this movie going habit that, that was still there and available for people to take advantage of. So yeah, I mean, I feel like if you look at the people who were kind of taking control of the art film business later in the '70s into the '80s, a lot of those people grew up on movies that they saw in art film theaters in the '60s and '70s and in the college film societies. So there's this sort of continuance of that culture, and so you're right, there is a real connection there.
You also put yourself in the film as a speaker. Was that an original intention or something that you came to later in terms of bridging the story?
I wanted to do everything I could to avoid being in the film. I mean, I realized, I mean, right from the beginning, the minute that it started to occur to me that there was a movie there, I realized that it might be necessary for me to be in the film. So I started shooting it in a way in which that was possible. But my hope was that when I got in the editing room, I would find a way of telling the story without that being true. But ultimately, I realized that as one of the youngest people who worked for Rugoff, I mean, literally, I was 23 years old when I started working there. As one of those people, I I had more vivid memories of a lot of things that other people didn't, and so it really did become necessary for me to to be in it in order to tell the whole story. I was the only person who was capable of sort of filling in the gaps and making some sense out of it. And then when the idea of structuring it as a journey for me to find out the truth about this guy occurred to me, there was a moment in time when I made a trip that had, I don't want to give away too much in advance for people who are about to see the movie, but where I launched into this journey, and in real life, it played out much like it does in the film.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time that I took that footage and cut it together, just strung it together to see what it looked like, is when I said, oh, you know what, this might work.
Oh.
And I just, you know, like again, it was not my preference to be in the film, but I felt like ultimately it was absolutely necessary.
Well, I have a question real quick, Ira, of not a spoiler for the movie, but I think it gives some context for the movie, but also, like you said, speaking to the relevance of the threat of TV versus the threat of streaming right now for art house theaters. One of the biggest hits of last year in the art house theater circuit, if not the biggest, was Parasite.
Mhm.
You have a really interesting blog post on your site that actually compares Costa Gavras' Z from 1970, which does appear in the film, and Parasite, as far as the campaign to get it out to the public, but also the awards campaign that was that RUGOFF put forward for Z. Could you kind of address that a little bit, like the parallels that you saw there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful accident of timing that right at the moment when my film was done and ready to show to people, that the whole Parasite thing was happening. And interestingly enough, the folks at Neon, the distributor of Parasite, um, were quoted in several articles as talking about Z as being the part of the inspiration for how they really went for it. And I guess, you know, that's the thing, is that what RUGOFF was, you know, the thing that he was the pioneer of is this kind of bungee jumping, if you will, of basically just saying, I'm going for it. I know it's suicidal. I know it, like, you know, that the odds of us getting anywhere with this are really slim. Everybody thinks I'm crazy, but I'm just going to go for it. And in a way, that's what Neon did with Parasite, is that they, you know, not to be too PG-13 here or whatever, but you know, they just went balls out and kind of, you know, said, I don't care that everybody's thinking that don't have a prayer in hell, but we're just going to go for it. And you know, that doesn't work every time out, but in a way, you're almost, when you don't go for it, you're almost telling the world that you can't get there, which has a you know, the effect of being a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in the fact that if there's anything wrong with the film business right now, it's that people are too risk averse.
True.
There's a lot of distributors who, I think that when you watch the way that they release their movies, they're saying out loud that they don't have a prayer, and I don't think that gives people the impetus to want to go see these movies in theaters, when in fact the distributors are showing that they really don't have any faith in it. How are they going to even know that it's there if there's not advertising money being spent, or if there isn't effort being put behind, you know, getting people into the seats? So, you know, in a way, one of the things I'm hoping is that the movie will inspire people who are in the business to see that, you know, nothing's impossible if you go for it.
And on that note, even though his name has faded from prominence, although it may come back thanks to your film, what do you see as a legacy that you can trace directly to Don Rugoff?
I think what's interesting is that it's all about the people who are still in the business and still trying to do the good work to get these movies to as big an audience as possible, whether they realize that it's Rugoff's legacy that they're tapping into or not. In a way, you know, it's clear that they don't know who Rugoff is, but because a lot of the people working today worked for people who then worked for people who then worked for Rugoff, or you know, and it's not just Rugoff. There were other people both before him and during his time that were also doing really good work. But the point is that it is a legacy that's really just been passed on from generation to generation, and what we have to make sure is that it doesn't disappear.
Well, I'm glad you made the film in that regard. It brought back and made me want to re-see a lot of classic art house films from that period. So I'm hoping I can find them at this point. Um, on a lighter note, I'm wondering how you've been spending your time given the environment that we're in now. Sheltering at home, doing a lot of watching, eating, what?
All of the above. Um, well, I mean, first of all, I am a full time professor at Columbia University, so I'm still teaching my classes, albeit via Zoom at the moment.
Mhm.
There's still a couple more weeks left of classes. So there's that going on. There's still faculty meetings and things like that. But I also, I have a lot of projects that I'm working on, and I'm lucky that all of them are in the stage where I can actually get work done remotely, because none of them were slated to go into production. I do have a film that, if all goes well, we're going to start shooting in October. And of course, that is something that is up for question at the moment. But we're acting as if it's going to happen. And if we need to postpone it, one of the things that movie producers are really good at is taking whatever is the current state of affairs and trying to adapt the plan. So I don't want to go there yet, but as we're developing it, of course, that's in the back of my mind. And then yes, I'm watching a lot of movies and TV and making myself occasional margaritas and
Cheers.
yeah.
I have to ask you, just because this is a rare opportunity to speak to someone with your depth of knowledge on the subject. Do you have any prognostications or predictions or hopes for the future of art house films, given the new reality that we're all living in right now?
Well, I mean, for starters, I'm not one of the people who believes that somehow this is the death of the movie industry. The movie industry has had so many deaths over the century that it's been in existence that I refuse to believe that it's going to go away. It's going to take some time for people to, be in a position where they feel like that they're going to be okay being in public again. But I do believe that there's going to be this pent up demand for people to want to be in collective experiences, which is what movies represent. I also believe that whenever you have something like this that forces you to pause and think about what the future is going to be, what ends up happening is that people come up with new ideas. And I do believe that a lot of what's been ailing the movie industry over the last 10 years or so has been this general malaise that I referred to earlier about people, sort of giving up before they start. But I also think that the business model of the way that movies are distributed and exhibited needs a real close look. And this is a good time to be looking at that. When we reemerge, what do we do to incentivize people to want to go to the movies more often? And I think that there's been some terrible mistakes made over the last couple of decades, not, including how much tickets cost, including the way that movie theaters have become these factories that are really not all that nice. Somehow, multiplexes have become, they've become these like Barco lounger,
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake. I think what they've been doing, whether they realize it or not, is subconsciously they've been equating the experience of going to the movies with the experience of being in your living room, which is not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that the at-home experience is a lean-back experience where you put your feet up and you have a margarita in your hands. But what makes the movie theater experience special is that it's a lean-in experience. You want to be with other people. And so if I had my druthers, I would throw all those Barco lounges out. There are regular theater seats that are comfortable and make you feel more like you're in the experience. And so, those are just examples. But I do think that we need to rethink what what our priorities have been. But I'm also incredibly hopeful. I feel like, when people are ready to go back out there, the movies are still going to be one of the best, most most joyful experiences, as long as we give them the experience that they want, and they're going to be craving that sort of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Very well put.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you, Ira.
Thanks so much for inviting me to do this.
And we've been talking with Ira Deutchman, who is the director of Searching for Mr. RUGOFF. I'm Dee Perry, and
I'm Aaron Spears. Thanks for listening to CIFF Speaks, and we will join you next time with another interview.